so much for coming to this talk. So I'm going to discuss an experiment that investigates how social interaction influences self-identity of people in general, and then also patients with schizophrenia. So all successful social interactions require that everyone involved is at least a little bit flexible. So I can't be my unbridled self up here. I am modifying who I am to be presentable to you. And right now, I see myself as prepared and polished, but I don't always. Some people, of course, are more or less socially flexible. So what does this flexibility look like? Past studies have shown that bicultural individuals, so for example, people born in the US to Chinese parents, have fluid self-identities, meaning that they measurably change how they see themselves depending on the social situation. It's been widely theorized that people who were born in a country to parents from that country, so single cultural individuals, also do this, but to a lesser extent. And the idea is that vertical transmission of social values from parent to child and horizontal transmission of social values between peers is compatible for single cultural individuals, but more diverse for bicultural individuals. So the degree of social flexibility is 2. Patients with schizophrenia sometimes report a loss of self or a divided self, and many socially oriented experiments report that these patients exhibit either hyperflexibility or hyperrigidity. So this is a prime clinical population for studying social interaction and changes in self-identity. So bicultural studies have examined changes in self-reported individualism and collectivism. These are self-construals. Individualism just means that self-identity is defined by internal attributes, values, and preferences. And collectivism just means that self-identity is defined by the external social relationships. Social value schema is a person's constellation of values. It's correlated with self-construal, but a person's schema may include social values that are more typically individualist or more typically collectivist, so it's a mix. It's more nuanced than self-construal, and it's not binary. This experiment conducted 2 social interactions and measured changes in self-construal and social values schema, and all participants were Anglophone Canadian. All the healthy participants had Canadian parents, and parents' cultural backgrounds were matched between patients and controls. Basically, participants learned about a fictional country that had opposite self-construal and social values from their own, and then met a friendly stranger from that country. And this process was repeated on a second day to see if the results were repeated or changed. We used a repeated measure design to capture baseline, and then also to look at how self-construal and social value changed after the social interactions. These are the results from the matched patient control cohort, which had 27 participants per group. But these results were also repeated in 65 healthy participants, and the results are nearly identical to the controls. Both healthy participants and patients suppressed their self-construal during social interaction. That's what this shows. Social value schema was a different story. Healthy participants also suppressed their social value schema during the interactions. However, patients increased their affiliation with the opposite social values. So basically, they reported holding their baseline social values and at the same time, contradictory social values that was endorsed by the person they met. This tells me that although their self-construals are suppressed, the constellation of values supporting those construals are actually being conflated between self and other. So this affected not only how patients saw themselves during the interaction, but also how they saw themselves in general. So several things were learned from this experiment. First, this experiment effectively demonstrated fluid self-identity in single culture individuals. Specifically, they suppressed their self-identity during social interactions. This is effectively a new method for social priming. It also demonstrates that self-identity is differently fluid for patients with schizophrenia. They hold 2 contradictory social value schemas simultaneously, essentially conflating self with other, which might explain why some studies report hyperflexibility and others report hyperrigidity. Both are happening depending on what you measure. The fact that patients' change in self-control resembles controls, while their change in social values didn't, tells me that social values are affected differently by social interaction than self-control is. It also tells me that patients are extracting the same social information as controls, but that they are applying this information differently. So this gives us some clues to the possible origins of disruption, which future studies can examine. This paradigm would also be useful to apply to other clinical populations defined by social difficulties to determine whether the problem is with extraction or the application of this social information in the other populations, and also to start to characterize social impairment and flexibility phenotypes. So thank you so much for listening, and the fMRI results from the study are going to be presented tonight at the poster spotlight session.